A 25-year-old George Dantzig barreled into Jersey Neyman's graduate statistics lecture at UC Berkeley one crisp morning in 1939, slid into a chair at the back, and feverishly copied down two giant equations scrawled across the chalkboard. The lecture hall buzzed with the low hum of chalk on slate, and those formulas looked so gnarly, packed with brackets and strange Greek letters, that George assumed they must be nothing more than the professor's uncollected homework. After all, who would give students problems that resembled the schematics for launching rockets? That afternoon, George trudged back to his apartment, tossed his satchel onto the table, and fired up the kettle for a pot of strong coffee. While his peers worked through routine textbook questions, he unfolded sheet after sheet of paper and laid out every draft side by side, determined to conquer those puzzles. He started by restating each problem in his own words, then chipped away at simpler cases before tackling the full-blown versions. Every time a line of algebra hit a dead end, he'd crumple that page, toss it aside, and start anew, until the calculations snapped into place like puzzle pieces. Night after night, neighbored by teetering stacks of notebooks and empty mugs, George persevered. He drew little diagrams to visualize abstract probabilities and flipped through reference texts to recall obscure theorems. When he stalled, he'd pace the room, muttering to himself, then return to the table with a fresh perspective. By the end of the week, every strike-through had been rewritten neatly, every equation checked, and both solutions were polished and complete. With characteristic modesty, George strolled back to campus clutching his notebooks, tapped on Neyman's office door, and slid his work inside with a polite, "Sorry I'm late." No drumroll, no self-congratulatory grin, just a casual apology. Neyman glanced at the papers, made a note, and tucked them away, probably assuming he'd review routine homework before the next class. 6 weeks later, George sat down to breakfast when Neyman came bursting through the door of his apartment, eyes shining, manuscript in hand, voice like a game show host. "I've just written an introduction to your paper," he announced, practically vibrating with excitement. Bewildered, George followed Neyman back to campus, where he discovered that the two homework problems were actually unsolved research questions in statistical theory, challenges that even senior academics had failed to resolve. Those solutions became George Dantzig's first published papers, marking his surprise debut in the world of scholarly research. The first tackled hypothesis testing, filling critical gaps in how statisticians decide whether data supports a theory. The second laid groundwork for what would evolve into linear programming, a method for finding the best possible outcome, like minimizing costs or maximizing profits, under given constraints. Emboldened by this accidental breakthrough, Dantzig continued his research, and in 1947 he introduced the simplex algorithm, a step-by-step procedure for solving linear programming problems efficiently. Overnight, well, not literally overnight, but in academic terms, his work became indispensable. Airlines used it to schedule crews and flight paths, manufacturers applied it to optimize production lines, and supply chain managers leveraged it to minimize shipping costs. The world was suddenly running on Dantzig's math. His career flourished. He taught at Berkeley and later at Stanford, served as a consultant for government and industry, and in 1975 was awarded the National Medal of Science. Yet through all the honors, George remained the same humble problem solver who once thought open research questions were just late homework. Looking back, it's almost laughable. A grad student shows up late, breezes through what he assumes is routine coursework, and unwittingly reshapes an entire field. No grand strategy, no epic quest, just curiosity, caffeine, and the audacity to dive in without worrying whether the problem was too hard. Dantzig's story teaches us that breakthroughs often come from fearless engagement, not from overthinking barriers. Sometimes, believing a challenge is manageable is the first step toward actually mastering it. Subscribe for more.